Hello there, I'm Eric Peckham, and this is the Monetizing Media podcast. As with my Monetizing Media newsletter, my goal is to dissect business opportunities across the media, entertainment, and gaming sector. I'm joined by a leading entrepreneur, executive, or investor in each episode as we dig into a case study on their company, an investment thesis they have, or other tactical insights on business models, pricing, and creating loyal fans. Today's episode digs into the future of audio. In particular, audio as a frontier of social media. My friend Arlen Marmel joined me to record it. He is currently an entrepreneur in residence at TCG Capital, a leading media investment firm. He's been exploring potential business opportunities in social audio and agreed to share his analysis. Before TCG, Arlen was an executive at Elation, Crunchyroll, and Hulu, with a focus on user acquisition and content distribution strategy. Hey Arlen, to kick this off, let's set some context. As you analyze different parts of the media industry, what drove your interest in the audio sector?
What's gotten me most interested in audio is that I feel like it's kind of where video was 10 years ago. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of the questions are still about, product. They're about technical innovation. They're about distribution. And if you look at what's happened with video, most of the questions around video, when people talk about Disney Plus or Netflix or any of these platforms, they're content questions. It's like, who's going to own the rights to Friends? Who's going to own the rights to Office? What's the next big original? Talk about Tiger King. I listened to Netflix's earnings call, and not once are they talking about, video compression or recommendation algorithms or anything like that. It's all about how much are you investing in content and where are we going from here? And there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, Netflix has dabbled in the sort of choose your own adventure kind of stuff, longer documentaries, things like that, where actually the distribution has influenced the content. And I think with audio, we're still in the first phase where a lot of the content is being repurposed either from terrestrial radio or even television. Like PTI is a very popular podcast. NPR obviously owns a lot of the most popular podcasts, but it's repurposed content. And if you look at a lot of the content that is being created for podcast distribution, it fits a very narrow band. It tends to be long form, it tends to be personality driven, and it tends to be an interview type format. There's some experimentation around the edges, but it's sort of pretty tightly banded. And I think that's because the distribution that exists today is actually not well set up for, you can't do a live podcast right now all that easily. The ability to distribute short form, you can do it, but the distribution is actually optimized to advance longer form content. There's no way to really channel surf on podcasts or switch between them easily. And so I think there's a lot of constraints on the product side and on the distribution side that are holding back the content. And as I think those constraints come down, as that friction lessens over time, I think we'll see a lot more innovation on the content side, because audio is actually a pretty elegant format. It fits really neatly into a lot of the sort of nooks and crannies of your life. And I think that's the reason why radio, for example, reaches more Americans than television or the internet on a weekly basis. It just fits really well into our lives.
Well, I think the restrictions right now with podcasting are also, there's just how it's organized, right? Of everything is about a show with a specific sense of what that show is. But if I just want to follow, maybe I'm interested in what you talk about across all sorts of different topics. I also am curious what you say on politics or this or that, which are different shows. It's also challenging for you as a creator to be I want to talk about multiple things, but I don't want to commit to one show in a traditional sense of podcasting. Or maybe I just want to follow what one person says across other people's, podcasts, or, I want to focus on a specific topic and I just care about the episodes that have already been recorded about that topic. And I don't care about the shows they're part of. I just want that one topic. It's a very particular way to slice discovery and consumption of audio.
Well, I think one of the challenges with what you're describing is that it involves navigation. If you're starting to move between different pieces of content, you need to be able to seamlessly navigate it. And audio today is not that well set up for it. It's really well set up for pressing play on something and then sitting there for 2 hours and listening. Obviously, from a voice input standpoint, it really isn't possible right now outside of smart speakers to sort of say, and it's the bare minimum. You can say pause. But navigating is a challenge with your voice because it's hard for the end consumer to visualize like exactly where they are in something. And so I think you actually need to better marry some of the navigation modalities that have been popularized on other platforms like TikTok or Instagram or even Snap, where you can sort of swipe between things and you can press and pause and things like that. I think bringing that to audio will really unlock a lot of opportunity. It just isn't there yet. And so I think continuing to evolve the interface is really useful. And so when I think of the future of audio, I don't think of it solely as an auditory experience. I think of the visual component as really enhancing it. And so, for example, when I'm listening to a podcast and they mention a link to an article or a picture or a video, I would love to be able to see that. I also would love to be able to sort through things like what you're talking about. Like maybe I want to kind of rapid fire through a bunch of different audio elements to find something I'm interested in, so that I was just talking with a friend. There's this email that goes out that lists like 10 different podcasts you should check out, and if you check them all out, it'd be it's like 20 hours of your time. It's not possible. So you kind of have to skim this list and see what you want, and they include quotes from the podcast. And I can't help but feel like that would be such a better delivery mechanism for that would be audio. Give me a summary of the podcast, give me some quotes from it, and then I can decide if I want to listen to the whole thing or not. And ideally, I'd like to be able to navigate through that easily. But obviously, the technology isn't there. And that's why I'm saying I think audio is really interesting, because I think evolving the product and the way that people consume audio will actually unlock a lot of content, opportunity, and innovation. And so the questions on audio are software questions today, I think, not necessarily just content questions.
I was jotting down notes just before we started as far as what are the categories of audio. And my thought was, if for now we leave aside audiobooks, music streaming, the like synthetic audio space of taking your voice and making it sound like Barack Obama or translating it. I feel like there were 5 that came to mind, which is podcasting, so kind of the broadcasting focus, these subscription direct-to-consumer audio experiences, or kind of like the Calms and Headspace, Blinkist, that's inside. The third, which is still a very nascent space, is voice-based games. So there's like Drive Time and Doppio and Volley, kind of like Alexa first, or maybe mobile first, all about gaming with your voice. And then in terms of social audio, I broke this into more the communications or live socializing audio, which is what is blowing up right now with Clubhouse, that kind of live experience of people in the same place where nothing happens with that audio afterwards. And the other one is more of the like Instagram for audio, where it's sharing clips in a space that's more about engaging with it after you kind of tapping through on an app. Do you think that's a good encapsulation of the different categories here?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. So one is your last category of sort of social. Like I think if you look at every other media, whether it's pictures, video, or text, there has been some evolution in bringing the barrier to entry way, way down and giving the average person a lot of tools to seem more professional. So for text, I think that's like Twitter. For video, I think of it like TikTok. And for photo and image, I think of it like Instagram. But audio doesn't have that. There isn't an equivalent in audio yet that has brought the barrier way down. We were talking a little bit about, like, if you want to start a podcast, the bar is really high. To me, podcasts, the analog for podcasts is like blogs or like a YouTube, where you just upload a video. It's just a distribution mechanism. It doesn't actually help you with discovery or with tools or make you seem more professional. And so I think that opportunity exists. The other thing I'll say about your categorization, your first one was broadcasting and your second one was subscription. And I probably would define it slightly differently, because I think of subscription as a business model. And I think a lot of the things you listed are more like niche services. So certainly Headspace is
I should have put more emphasis on the kind of direct to consumer, like owning your own channel.
Yeah, they're picking a category where audio is a great vehicle for it, and they're building a community around it. Your first one of broadcasting is interesting, but I could envision a future where subscription is actually a really good fit for private podcasts. So it's more like what I would call narrowcasting, where like I want to have an exclusive distribution of audio content, and it still may seem a lot like a podcast. It may be an interview type content, or it may be scripted content, who knows, but people will pay for access to that. So I think, those categories weren't totally mutually exclusive for me, but I do think in general, you've summarized where things are happening. There's been a lot of experimentation, I would say, in just translating print to audio. And I think a lot of the time that falls down because I think audio is, it's really good for some things and not as good for others. And I think content has to be purpose-built for audio. So if you just read an article and there's tons of numbers in there, you lose interest right away because your brain just can't absorb that many numbers when you're talking about them. You also have to be more descriptive in audio. And so I think you really need to create content purposely for an enriching audio experience. And as I said to you before, I can really envision a future where there's more content that's audio first, but not audio only. Meaning if I'm not using my eyes, that's fine. I can just listen. But the experience can be greatly enriched by using your eyes. I think an example of this is like, when you listen to Spotify, and if you open the app, they'll follow the words along and you can actually see the lyrics. Like, I think that's a very low stakes sort of example, but I can envision a world where you're listening to something and I can click on a word and see, almost like the way Genius works. Or as I mentioned, if there's a link or a video, I can pause on that. I can watch the video and go back to the audio. You're blending the boundaries between text, video, image, and audio, because I think that will create the richest experience. But I still think audio is the best at seamlessly fitting into all these aspects of your life because you can do it without needing your eyes.
One of the questions I have on this point with audio is basically how much the content consumer has to invest in consuming it, right? Which is, I guess, one component of this is it's more like a video in the sense of you can't just scroll past and skim over it or consume it in the way you can an article or a photo, right? So you have to actually stop and press play and go some distance into listening in order to understand what you're getting, whether you like it or not. So in that sense, there's a bigger commitment just to explore content.
Today, but that's why I think it's like where video was 10 years ago, because like if you went to Hulu, there's a lot of seek and destroy behavior. It's a heavy commitment. Even Netflix today, like you have to sift through everything and then you have to pick something and then I'm on my couch watching something for an hour and I'm probably binging it. But like if you think about the way TikTok works, I open the app and something's playing immediately and I'm like, not into this swipe, not into this swipe until I'm into something. And then I interact with that thing and then maybe I go down the rabbit hole of that creator or whatever. But like audio hasn't had that moment, where it's a lot more passive than what you're sort of describing. And yeah, there's interaction, but there's an algorithm that's doing a lot of heavy lifting for me versus me doing the heavy lifting to figure out what I want to consume. Discovery is still not, I think, where it should be in audio.
The other challenge that I've been thinking through is audio as your secondary rather than primary focus. If you are looking at a photo, watching a video, reading an article, that is your primary focus. But when I think of audio experiences right now, they're all, whether it's listening to the radio, listening to a podcast, listening to music, you're generally doing something else simultaneously. You're not just sitting down and only focusing on what you're listening to. And I'm curious how much that restricts what could happen with this type of content. This has been part of my issue with kind of the voice-based games category is if something is that interactive that requires your focus, don't you just want the extra stimulation of it being visual in some way?
I think it's not just the extra stimulation, which I think is a great point, but it's also if you're playing a game, like I heard an example recently where it was like, if I tell my smart speaker to skip to the next thing and whatever, the amount of time and energy it took to do that versus me just poking a button to go to the next. It's a lot easier to just hit the button. And so I think your voice is good for certain things, but not necessarily everything. And so that's why for me, I think the future looks more like audio first, not audio only. I think things can be audio led. And, I think it'll be like one of the things that I was noodling on a little bit is like, could I tell a story and then a visual layer would be placed on top of that? A very simple version of this is like, when you play music and they have that visual that kind of follows the music. Like what if you could take that a step further and like actually characters were saying what, the story that I was telling, and, voice was an input as opposed to the entirety of the modality. I think that is an interesting direction. And I think too often right now we treat it as binary. It's like it's either pure audio content or it's video. And I think we need to get closer to like, what's the middle of that?
What I envision here, and it's because I'm kind of benchmarking off of what I see in other formats, is something that feels like a, Instagram or Twitter, but centered around audio clips where, the core content is the audio that you're consuming, but in terms of discovery, sharing, discussing that content with friends, that's still, text-based and visual.
Yeah, I think so. Because in a lot of ways, it's just a lot easier to have that interaction, by manual input versus using your voice. And so I think we'll see more voice input because where it's useful, it's really useful. Meaning if I'm cooking and I want to pause something, the best way to do that is to say pause, right? But if I want to scrub back 47 seconds to a particular moment, my voice is probably not the best way to do that. Visual tools and aids actually help a lot in certain instances. And so just the idea of a scrub bar is actually like really powerful. I really think that the future of audio is more visual, but video is still its own category. Some things that I think are pretty straightforward that are still absent. So if I want to share a clip with someone, it's very hard to do today. If I want to just highlight or bookmark some content for me to go back to, that's not really possible. And so, I think we're hitting on a bunch of different things, from the way that podcasts are distributed to the social layer that sits on top of them to, frankly, the interface. And I just, I keep coming back to the same point, which is that's why I think audio is interesting, because I think there's a lot of product and technical innovation that is yet to come that will unlock content innovation. But it doesn't surprise me. Like when you look at the diversity of content on radio relative to podcasts, it's actually far more diverse. There's lots of different types of shows and types of content. And podcasts, I think, sit in a pretty tight band. Like even if you look at news podcasts, they're mostly like investigative journalism or things like The Daily. They're not actually like hard and breaking news because podcasts just aren't well suited for that right now. Twitter is probably better for that. I don't think that has to be the case per se. I mean, the radio is really good for breaking news, right? So it's clear that audio is a good format. It just, streaming audio doesn't work that way. I feel like we're in streaming audio 1.0. And there's a lot of room. There's still a big gap between that and sort of 2.0 or 3.0.
In terms of the technical challenges here, how much is this about natural language processing getting better in, speech to text, right? To be able to automatically transcribe any audio accurately. And then on top of that, to actually understand what the audio says, so that others can search it, not just by a word for word search, but contextually.
This is not totally my area of expertise, but I think from just envisioning what that product could look like, it's very odd to me that every podcast doesn't A, have a transcript, B, offer me the ability to, like, if something is mentioned in a podcast and I don't know what that is, some treaty, why can't I kind of pause that podcast relatively seamlessly and get more information on what that is? Like, there's no reason why that, couldn't happen. I guess to me, I feel like the experience today is very much one way, and I want it to be much more immersive, and I want it to be much more interactive. And I think that means that streaming audio has to get a lot smarter. It's still quite dumb. It's just sort of press play, lean back, and listen. And I think a large part of that is because if you just confine it to audio, and if you confine it to voice as the input, it's quite limiting. But if you start to envision a world where, every, say, podcast actually has a visual component, what I think will happen is that the content will start to look really different as the interface and the distribution evolves. I think we'll start to see greater diversity of content, more interaction. I mean, we haven't even talked about interaction or being able to, if you look at the kind of behaviors that are being popularized on other platforms like emoting or interacting, why isn't that present in audio at all? And it's because it's mostly pre-recorded and then distributed later, and most of the distribution platforms aren't really meant, certainly not for live content, but also not for timely. Like, if you want to do an interesting experiment, try to create a 5-minute podcast and distribute it every hour and push it to the platforms. Like, it doesn't work that well, and they're not set up to receive a podcast every hour that update. It's not built for short form. It's not built for sort of interest-based discovery like we were talking about earlier. There's just so many gaps, I think, which is why the content is so tightly banded and constrained today. And so I'm really excited and interested to see how that evolves as voice input takes off, as some of the visual input gets married into audio. I think there's so much room for evolution there.
Give me some examples of what, in your mind, if we have these tools, a lot of the most popular content will look like.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at podcasts today, it's basically two buckets, because as you've already identified, creating a podcast is a little bit heavyweight and it's kind of like a big ongoing commitment. And so we see either these like heavily produced podcasts that are, true crime or what have you, or we see these long form interviews. And I think what we don't see is a lot of short form. We don't see a lot of disposable content because the bar is still really high. And so I think, as you reduce the friction to creating audio content, as you make it more seamless for someone to navigate, amongst content, I think we'll see the volume just go way up of audio content that is produced for streaming purposes. And I also think we'll just see a lot more variance in format, whether that's games or, again, just disposable content, just breaking news, a meme. I don't think that it will be in one particular category. I think you'll see everything, as opposed to today where we really just see like true crime and interviews. And frankly, a lot of the formats that are becoming ever present in video, which again is like disposable content. That's, the most popular thing on the platform is there for 24 hours and then no one ever looks at it again. I don't see why that isn't possible in audio as well, where you can really increase the pace of innovation, the pace of content creation, and you can democratize who's creating the content.
You can't predict until you just have masses of people, particularly young people, testing it out and kind of ultimately figuring out, if this is the right length, or this is what makes something funny or makes something viral within this medium.
It's an entirely different skill. And when I look at podcasts, it's still like, if you look at the early days of television or radio or the internet, like it was the previous medium being translated. So, even with Hulu, it was just like we were taking television and putting it on Hulu. Now shows are being created specifically for streaming and they're a little different. If you look at podcasts, it's basically just your standard old radio show being streamed. So what we haven't seen yet is what is the real flavor, like what is streaming, what is unique about streaming audio that wasn't present in radio. And I think we're just not there because a lot of the things we're talking about, the distribution, the interface layer, but also the interaction. Like there's no reason, when you're distributing something via streaming, like interaction can be a much heavier component of that. You can also, like, I think just like the meme culture that exists on TikTok, where I don't really have to have an original content idea. I just have to copy a meme and then I have content. Like I expect that all of that evolution will occur in audio as well, where the bar, for entry comes way down. It's just a lot of things have to happen around the product for us to get there.
Who innovates in terms of the next wave of audio? Obviously, Spotify is trying to really own podcasting and new audio formats. Would it be an existing social platform, Instagram, Twitter, who says, oh, let's do something with audio, and they incorporate that into the existing product? Or do you see it as definitively this will come from new startups that aren't influenced or attached to existing structures?
Yeah, my gut is the latter, because I think a lot of what we're talking about are entirely new modalities. And I think, like, even by way of your example of Spotify, is designed around music, and they're kind of like retrofitting podcasts in there. So they've been creating these like podcast playlists. And I'm like, if I was starting from scratch on podcast discovery, would a playlist be the way that I would do that? Probably not, right? Playlists work really well for songs that are 2 to 3 minutes. But I think for podcasts, it doesn't feel like the natural way to discover. And so that's just one example. But I think, because we're talking about product innovation, I think the ideas have to be a little more outside the box and not chained to pre-existing platforms. And so I expect that it will come from more of the startup world than those platforms. And I think we've already seen that a lot of the bigger platforms, podcasting or streaming audio just isn't at a scale yet where it is particularly compelling for them. I think it will grow, and I think there will be more acquisitions, but my gut tells me it will come from the startup world, because we're talking about innovations from a product and technology standpoint. And I just think startups are better suited for that.
Why hasn't this happened already from your perspective? Right? Like, a lot of the things we're talking about don't have technical constraints that were that different 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? Of like, at least in the sense, I think some of the natural language processing, that stuff, is still about pioneering new technology. But like, to be able to have an app that, just from a product standpoint, organizes audio clips in a different way for interaction. And obviously there have been some startups in the past that tried that and didn't scale in a big way. What do you think is different now?
It's a great question. So I don't have a perfect answer, but I'll come at it from a few different lenses. I think one is the ability to use voice as an input is more available now than ever. I have no less than 4 smart speakers in my home. And so there's just more devices that are, quote unquote, smart. Terrestrial radio works really well over a radio, but when you're wearing AirPods, I think that unlocks a lot of opportunity. So I think that's one, but that's not a particularly original idea. I think a lot of people are talking about the fact that, whether are AirPods a platform or they not, like, I won't enter that fray, but I'll just say that I think we have more smart devices between things like AirPods and smart speakers than ever before. And so I think that's one opportunity. I think another answer to your question is, frankly, just there's more money in video. It's a higher value space to innovate in. And as I've mentioned a few times, I think a lot of the innovation has happened there. And so I suspect that, there's an opportunity in media to turn the attention to audio. But, just if you looked at the pie 10 years ago, television is far more valuable than radio, right? Because it's dual monetization. It's advertising and subscription. And radio historically has been just advertising. Now, SiriusXM is subscription. And so, that speaks to the potential. But I just think, practically speaking, video has been a higher value medium. And I think, frankly, just a sexier medium. And so it's just a more, sort of interesting and maybe desirable place to innovate. And so, those are a few things that come to mind. The other thing that I'll say is I still think radio works really well. Like, we all still drive cars and we drive them ourselves. We're not yet, leaning back and letting the car drive itself. And all those cars come with radios, and they're very easy to use. And I don't think we've cracked the nut on how to make the phone integrate as seamlessly as it should in a car. And And, I live in New York. Up until relatively recently, if you're in the subway, it's hard to stream stuff. And so there's some constraints, I think, that have helped radio be resilient. But I think that the opportunity outweighs that historical benefit, meaning all of the upside that can come from the interaction, it just needs its moment. I think a lot of people said, like, why would we have e-education? It's so much richer when you're in the classroom together. And then you have a moment like this and you go, oh, that's why, because it's actually quite useful if we can't get together in person for one reason or another. And I just don't know that audio has had that total watershed moment yet. Where, like, in general, like, radio is still pretty good. And I think if you're going to change behavior, it's a very hard thing to do. And often it happens when the new thing is like 10x or more better than the old thing. And I don't think streaming audio is yet 10x better than just turning on your radio and, like, listening to what's on. So I think, we've got to innovate our way there. I don't know that that's a perfect answer, just a bunch of hypotheses.
Yeah, I also wonder about the business model of a kind of next generation social audio platform, right? If these sorts of audio ads that you get if you're on, a free tier of Spotify, say, seem more awkward, interruptive in that environment, right? And maybe it's because, if it exists in an app that also has a visual component, maybe it's the same sort of advertisements that are in other social apps. Or maybe there's something to the kind of multi-format interactivity that allows for a freemium model in a way that we haven't seen in Western countries, at least, take off at kind of in social apps, or some sort of tipping or in-app purchases type of model.
I don't have a great answer. I mean, I think we saw Luminary try to put a paywall in front of exclusive content, and I don't think it worked incredibly well, in large part because I don't think that content was incredibly differentiated from the abundance of free content that's available. And so, given my background, I'm a big believer that people will pay for differentiated content. I just think there's an abundance of similar free content in podcasting right now. And so as you start to see more innovation on fiction or just increasingly differentiated, higher value content, I think certainly that's possible. I think also paying for more exclusive content from individuals is possible. I think paying for a richer, higher order feature experience. Like, before Spotify came along, there are other ways I could stream music. But Spotify as a product is really good. Like, I don't really pay Spotify for exclusive content. I pay them for this product that is really great and has some network effects. And so that may be where it evolves. It remains to be seen, but I don't think because audio has historically been a medium dominated solely by advertising, that means the future will solely be dominated by advertising. And I think SiriusXM tells us people will pay for a differentiated experience. I just don't think we know what that differentiated streaming audio experience is yet.
So what are you digging into? I'm just curious, as you're looking at different, whether it's existing startups in the space and what's exciting to you, or kind of different ideas you've hashed out, or maybe things you explored and then decided weren't compelling opportunities.
What I've been most interested in is two things: short form audio, and that's obviously a big category, but just experimenting with what makes the most sense in short form. And I don't have a perfect answer yet. And the second thing I'm very curious about is what is the optimal way to interact with audio? Because I don't think it's just about your voice. I think these concepts are related. Like, I think the reason why there isn't a lot of short form audio is because by definition, you need to interact with it more. And I think we don't really know what the interaction is. And so I'm trying to crack the nut on what that looks like and what makes the most sense from a content perspective and from an interaction perspective. So that's what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about right now.
Well, excited to catch up again soon as you go deeper.
Thanks for listening to the Monetizing Media podcast. To keep learning more tactical insights on the media, entertainment, and gaming industry, subscribe to my Monetizing Media newsletter at monetizingmedia.com.